So I should say, firstly, thank you very much for having me. It's really appreciated. My name's Maloney. I'm one of the lecturers at the University of York in the Music Research Centre, and I'm certainly feeling kind of old school in terms of what I do compared to some of the incredible research that's been shown here so far this week. I've been pondering a question for some years now, and it's asking questions about the kind of religiosity. Why does house music, particularly early house music, present as either semi or quasi or sort of pseudo religious in nature when we talk about its lyrical and its musical components? And rather than play a ton of examples, I'll just throw that in the chat. That's a Spotify link that's kind of got a ton of examples in there for you to kind of peruse at your leisure. And I'm not expressly talking about gospel house, which is something of its kind of own devising that comes around towards the back end of the 90s. We're talking more about early house, like Jamie Principle's Baby Wants to Ride, which opens with a fragment of like Black Paternoster and references to revelations, biblical revelations. Or an example that I'm sure everyone knows would be kind of You Got to Love the Candy Staton track, which was obviously the source, and then the Jamie P and Frankie Knuckles version. And it's kind of an interpolation of the Our Father, the Lord's Prayer from kind of Christian prayers. So that's kind of been the question that's been obsessing me. But I think the more interesting question is actually querying the source of that religiosity. Where does it initially come from? What's the initial impetus for that? And why has that kind of been maintained throughout house music? Now, there are a load of possible explanations out there, and I'm sure many of you are already aware of quite a few of them. There's obviously kind of the easy kind of beginners go-to, which is presenting that kind of standard narrative of house music coming out of disco and that kind of that lost period of dance music between 79 and 84 in the States. And with disco having its roots in gospel and R&B and soul and traditionally kind of Black African-American musics, the importance of the church within those as kind of a founding religious background and a founding musical background for those genres is not to be understated. It's obviously carrying through from those genres into disco and then through into house music. If you think about Girl, You Need a Change of Mind by Eddie Kendricks, that's kind of our first experience of the fourth to the floor kick drum, really, in kind of what you might call approximately proto-disco. And in the liner notes, Kendricks himself says that that breakdown section where we hear the 4/4 kick drum for the first time came out of the church, and then we get that kind of disco break building up in a link to the kind of Pentecostal tradition. Other people have kind of followed through on this. Archbishop Calbean of Born This Way fame before finding religion, identifies it as, if you really listen to the backbeat of disco, it is the rhythm of what he refers to as the black shout. They basically took that rhythm that you hear in the black shout, that rhythmic pattern that became disco that was done with the drum. You hear that in the black church all the time. So from here, we can kind of see at the birth of disco, it's actively using the church's musical kind of lexicon to articulate itself. And that carries through into house music. There are some other kind of interesting notions out there. Hillegana Rietveld, who might be here, which is not at all intimidating, has this notion of a communal soul. Talking about the idea that in house music, instead of directing one's devotion to Jesus, the gospel-inspired focus is to the community. In house music, Jesus or a deity is replaced by the community and is replaced by the music itself. We can probably go a little bit further than that as well and say that it might be important for early house music audiences to actively kind of kill God within their music. House music arguably represents kind of the positive aspects of a religious faith without any of the Puritanism and the like subversion or the removal of a deity and those inherent moral judgments, those established conservative dogmatic moral judgments, might have been particularly relevant and particularly freeing for house music's early queer audiences. Several people have suggested, Ward, perhaps the best example of them, suggests that the church was a quite powerful locus from which homophobia was disseminated. But Ward also goes on to say, and rightly so, that it's not exclusive to the Black church, nor is it the stance of all churches, nor is it, quote unquote, the church as a singular institution. But around the time of house music's creation, we can certainly say that there are visible voices in the church that are actively promoting homophobia. So Billy Graham's famous comments about AIDS being a punishment sent from God being a prime example of that. So removing God from the equation and replacing it with community kind of cycles us back round into Hildegarda Reeville's communal soul. There's also the kind of hip-hop sampling arguments, the idea that it's somehow collage and ancestor worship and teaching and the maintenance of culture and co-opting the power of the church to articulate itself is in there, as are elements to do with kind of the civil rights movement and the lexicon that comes from that, which was informed by the church anyway. And so when we get things like Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech cycled back into house music through sampling, we're kind of reinforcing. We see that kind of reinforcement of that lexicon in there. And I think all of these are true, and there's many more, like the proto-plur aesthetic that's going on in early disco. I think all of these are likely true in some sort of percentage or some sort of arrangement. But I think there is another argument that's well worth exploring, and it's a kind of historically informed socio-economic argument for this religious quality in house music. And this came out of some primary research I did in Chicago a few years ago, trying to explore this question. And I spoke to Vince Lawrence, arguably the first house music producer, produced On and On in 1984, probably the first house track out there. And he said that the church is where musicians come from in Chicago. That's the great thing about the church in Chicago. They make up for what a lot of the school system doesn't offer. So yeah, nobody's learning how to play their fucking instruments in school. They're learning in church. Just look at the economics. Chicago being as segregated as it is, and with all the redlining and all the stuff that happened in the 60s and 70s, you know that all the money is in one area and all apparent lack of it is in other areas. And you go out into this desert, this economic desert, and you find these flowers growing, and they're usually around the church. And this statement from Vince really hit home with me. And so I kind of dived into this to pull it apart and try and understand the kind of intricacies of Chicago and see if we can directly present this argument that Vince Lawrence is offering here, this kind of socio-economic argument, as a possible rationale for the religiosity or semi-religiosity of house music. And so this is where I'm going to take on a very quick history lesson. I know that many of us in the UK especially are probably not au fait with what redlining was, although in the States it's probably much more well known. And redlining was a practice whereby certain geographic areas and communities were denied loans and insurance by banks and other providers on the basis of race and class demographics in a given neighborhood. This initially came out of work by Park, Burgess, Mackenzie, and Hoyt, who presented this economic model of neighborhood change, an economic model even, that purported to predict the fortunes of a neighborhood based on its makeup. Ironically, this comes out of the University of Chicago in 1925. And most notably, this 1925 publication begins to suggest that the, quote, invasion of lower status and or black residents into a white area will precipitate a severe decline in property prices, according to Jackson. But these things, these ideas, this model of neighborhood change, although developed in 25, begins to see some traction in the 30s. These theories are actually put into practice on a macro scale from 1933 onwards, when Roosevelt's New Deal founds the Homeowners Loan Commission, the HLC. The idea of the HLC was actually to ease issues with rural foreclosures and aid in urban housing. But what actually happens is the work that was done particularly by Park and Hoyt provides the HLC with a methodology to assess the security of loaning and mortgaging to residents in particular areas. So in conjunction with banks and brokers, the HLC were able to codify specific city blocks or areas based on ethnicity, income, and living conditions. This is a redlining map that was produced by the HLC back in 1940, and this is of the south side of Chicago. The loop, if you're aware, is just kind of north in the center there. But this includes the 4 possible grades that we get in a redlining map, which is A, B, C, and D, green, blue, yellow, and red in that order. And the A grades, there's actually only one listed in 1940 on the south side, in green right in the center there, are described as exclusively white and highly desirable. B grades, the blue ones, were still desirable but might decline in the far future. C grades, the yellow, were, quote, already in decline with an influx of black residents and residents of other ethnicities. And D grades already had the effects of C grading felt for some substantial time. In essence, the HULC are creating a geographical racial profiling system. I should say that this information comes primarily from the Mapping Inequality Project at the University of Richmond in Virginia, and they've got a wealth of historical documentation about redlining here. And as you dive into that, you see things about these demographic makeups described rather unpleasantly, with D-band graded areas, those that were predominantly home to African Americans, described with phrases like, "This district is blighted and has no future." That's from this report. And if you dive really deep into the reports, you see racist and really problematic language with phrases like blight and undesirable and lower grade and hazardous. And the most insidious one that I came across was talk of non-white residents, quote unquote, infiltrating some areas. In essence, redlining constructed a government-sanctioned discriminatory index to limit the social mobility of Black and other ethnicities in the USA. So redlining is abolished in '68 and officially put to bed in the 2018 Fair Housing Act, which I find absolutely baffling. But it leaves Chicago as this dichotomous or bisected city split across north and south lines. And whilst redlining was done away with in '68, we still feel the legacy of that in stuff like Disco Demolition Night, which I think is perhaps the most obvious moment where these dichotomies play out. When we have these quite simplistic, but there is a grain of truth in this, these quite simplistic differentiations between black and white, disco and rock, gay and straight, south and north, playing out in this one moment of kind of cultural and physical violence perpetrated in Chicago against marginalized communities. I won't talk any more about Disco Demolition. It's been talked about to death, so let's move on. Chicago's house music scene, there was initially the province of young African Americans from specific areas in the South Side, coming particularly out of certain schools like Mendel High School, Kenwood Academy, Whitney Young, Aquinas, and Columbus, and a whole raft of schools on the South Side that provided an outlet for this burgeoning scene. During that interview with Vince, he said that if you look at the parties when it started, the parties at Mendel High were Black and lower middle class kids. And we know now from analysis from economists that we can directly connect the socio-economic deprivation still felt in historically redlined areas to the efficacy of educational establishments. Redlining is still the primary causal factor, or one of the primary causal factors, for substandard conditions in inner city schools, even within the same district, because taxes support schools and citizens in those areas pay fewer taxes. It also results in undercutting local property values and therefore property taxes, and so education funding and music education funding is adversely affected. And house music drops at a time where there have been swaging cuts made to the National Endowment for the Arts. Certainly stands to reason that music is therefore on the chopping block for most of these schools. And so this brings me back around to Vince's initial statement. He's talking about these young African Americans learning their musical skills in church. He's actually presenting this as a socio-economic argument for house music's religiosity, for these kind of religious, lyrical and musical components in house music. He's saying that these individuals are learning their craft in the church rather than a school system or any other private setting. And that's a consequence of redlining. Now, I must say there is no direct evidence of a specific organized strategy or organized drive by all the churches in Chicago in the 70s and 80s. It didn't happen in an organized fashion. Rather, it was this kind of ad hoc approach to musical education for Chicago's Black youth. However, given that for many, the African-American church, the Pentecostal tradition, is the rockbed of African-American culture, especially at this time still, before the polarization of the conservative right, we can't understate the importance of the church for many of these young individuals. What we can state, though, is that there was an active drive on grassroots levels from many pastors and preachers to engage young people in musical training. I'm just going to fire a list off at you here. So a considerable number of early figures in house music were explicitly trained in the church in bands and choirs. So Robert Owens, Jocelyn Brown, Tyree Cooper, Martha Wash, Ricky Dillard, Vince Lawrence, Keith Nunnally, Sean Christopher, and Jamie Principle all received their education in churches and choirs. This is one of the best pieces of evidence I've found to support this, and this is an image of T.L. Barrett, famous gospel star, and presided over the Life Center Church of Universal Awareness on the south side near Mantle High. And in the background there, the gentleman in the white jacket on the left is a very young Daryl Pandin. I think Tyree Cooper is in this image, but I'm not quite sure. However, there's definitely evidence of this happening on a grassroots level. And even Jamie Principle, when he was interviewed, said that his pastor was really adamant about them learning some form of musical instrument, which explains how Jamie Principle ends up as this multi-instrumentalist in house music. And so I'm going to wrap this kind of up here, I suppose. So the narrative that's often transmitted and shared about house music's origin, while, approximately true, does often lack an appreciation of Chicago's broader socioeconomic heritage and context, and lacks sometimes the nuance that we need to appropriately comprehend these intricacies and the roots of house music's musical language. And I think this represents a little part of house music's history that has been hidden for a long time. I think it is our scholarly responsibility, though, to begin to reconnect these dots, I think. And we do that by engaging with, the progenitors and creators of house music and encouraging some kind of reparative autoethnography. We are in a privileged position here, and so we should be using our privilege to engage and uplift and share this narrative, which is part of our kind of shared cultural dance music, cultural history. And the last thing I'll kind of say on this before I properly stop talking, I will stop talking in a second, I promise, is to kind of ask the question, when we talk about a possible rather than the definite article, when we talk about a possible history of house music, where do we begin? Do we begin in 84 with the first house music record? Do we start with disco in like 72? Do we start with the HULC in 33? Do we go all the way back to Park and Hoyt's 1925 publication? Or does this start in the Great Depression? Where does house music come from? It's all very well and good for Farley Jackmaster Funk and Mel Sharon to come up with these pithy one-liners like it's the bastard child of disco or it's disco on a budget, respectively. But arguably, I think it goes deeper than that. I think there is more to this story than we know to this day. I think it's a really interesting thing to explore. And so I will call it there, and I will say thank you very much for your time. And there's a massive list of things. And I need to figure out how to stop sharing.
Thank you, Liam. It's a very fascinating talk. And as we wait for people to maybe send some questions into the chat, I was wondering if you could, it's a fascinating subject of the nexus of economics and religion. How are you defining religion there? This is implicit understanding that this is the gospel is the Christian roots here, but perhaps you could say a little bit more about, because it seems like you were implying a lot about religion and you didn't maybe have enough time to state that.
So house music's approach to religion is quite a fascinating one. It's quite a broad approach as well. There is obviously, as I said at the start, there is gospel house, which kind of comes along later and almost kind of re-energizes the religious component within house music and makes it expressly religious. But before the year 2000, there are very few tracks that reference any kind of God or deity. I found one track that references Jesus before that point. But there is this kind of swathe of stuff and all these themes within house music about kind of utopias, about belief. This belief theme is about believing in music, believing in the community, but it's never about believing in anything that's identifiable as a kind of figure or a center point in some kind of monotheistic religious context. The instruments that you get, there's also a huge amount of kind of reference points within the instrumentation that you get. So you get stuff that you would typically associate with gospel and Pentecostal band traditions. So you get organs, you get bits of guitars, you often get quite a lot of acoustic-y sounding drums. There's a great example which came out only after the year 2000, which is believed by Jocelyn Brown and Ministers de la Funk, which is almost riffing on this pastiche. It's almost hit this point now where these religious elements that you would associate with what you would hear in a church within the Pentecostal tradition are almost like amplified to the point where it becomes almost not a joke, but it's certainly pastiche or homage within that track. It's a really great example. So when we talk religion, it kind of covers a huge amount of material. Now, honestly, I could talk for about 12 hours and kind of define the different methodologies by which you can kind of point at these religious notions.
Sure. Thank you. So we have a few questions here, and I'm just going to go by the timing of the question. So we have a question from Richard Addison. He's asking about, are there any similar findings in the US like New York, Detroit, Philadelphia?
Really interesting point. So New York becomes a really difficult one because obviously there was the notion that house was going to play off against New York garage with the kind of Frankie Knuckles, although whether it was Frankie or not is another question, and the kind of Larry Levan style garage remixes. And garage is almost devoid of any of these kind of reference points. It seems to continue what was happening in that, again, that lost period that Tim Lawrence has talked about in the last book, that kind of 79 to 84 period where you have dance music, but it is dance music that doesn't really exist in the same space or the same kind of emotional or spiritual place as house music does. So there isn't really anything like that happening in New York that I've been able to identify. You do get the kind of Yoruba stuff that happens towards the end of the 90s. Detroit obviously has the techno thing, but whereas house music decides to put its faith in this kind of civil rights, religious, Pentecostal kind of lexicon, Detroit kills God automatically with technology and then embraces a dystopian, cyborgian future. So I don't know if there is too much to be found anywhere else in terms of what was going on.
Okay, well, I think that you may have in part answered a question from Jack McNeil, but it was a question from Vincent Yenaween. If the church was a bedrock of community at the time, wouldn't it have been central in music education, even if music had been taught in school? Is there further proof for that causal relation?
That's a really interesting question. That's something worth considering. Obviously, there is that difficult relationship between the church and the state in the USA that's always been quite challenging for school systems to negotiate whether religion has a place in schools or not. And arguably, that's probably down to the individual schools and individual locations in which it was taught. I'd probably argue that maybe St. Columbanus, which is one of the schools that I mentioned in Chicago, which is where Chip E got his musical education, which was actually a kind of a more middle-class school, a grammar and fee-paying school, if memory serves. That was likely more religious in nature and therefore probably would have had some of those religious elements kind of tagged on. Whereas other things like Kenwood and Whitney Young were public schools in the States, i.e. state schools in the UK, and therefore probably would lack that religious quality within the musical education. But it's a really interesting point that is well worth actually exploring. Yeah, that's a really interesting point. So thank you, Vincent. Really appreciate that.
We probably have one more time for one more question here. We have a little bit more time in this session because one of our speakers isn't speaking. There's a question here from Richard Addison. The term house that was used to define a church, the house of God. Is there any notion that house was an extension of the house party, it says?
Oh, God. Yeah, the notion of where house, even as a word, comes from is fairly nebulous. The kind of accepted narrative is about it coming, or being like a bastardization of Frankie Knuckles' Warehouse. But the Warehouse closed down at least 2 years before any official house music, anything we can identify as house music, was made. The kind of apocryphal story is that Frankie Knuckles drove past a record store and they said, "We sell house music," in the window. Whether there's any truth to that or not, I don't think we'll ever know. The origins of the term house has kind of been lost, and too many people have put claim to it to actually give you any decent answer to that question. It's so indefinable in terms of where that name and that story comes from. So I'm afraid I can't.
I don't think we'll get to the root of that right here at this moment. Thank you, Liam. Thank you very much for that fascinating talk.